Prime Minister Trudeau says no NAFTA deal is better than a bad NAFTA deal. True in theory, but this is no theoretical classroom debate. It is about whether the very real terms of the recent US-Mexico agreement are acceptable to Canada, with a few tweaks. Much of the public commentary around the deal echoed the Prime Minister. It's frequently characterized as some kind of worst-case scenario, well beyond the bounds of the politically doable. We take a different view. While there are a number of outstanding issues, especially that of dispute settlement, what is on offer ought not to be just acceptable to Canada. It is emphatically in Canada's interests. Hard-headed realism must guide our choices now. There is no place for regret for a bygone era of Canada-US amity. Indeed, such misplaced nostalgia is one reason we find ourselves in these circumstances in the first place. Equally, we cannot afford to let Canadians' almost universal distaste for the President color our decisions. Pointless gestures like somehow standing up to Trump against our own national interests are, well, pointless. Roughly 1/5 of our economy depends on exports to the US market, whereas less than 2% of the US economy depends on Canada. That reality defines our bargaining power. The deal now on the table, setting aside the seemingly unresolved dispute settlement question, shouldn't just be acceptable to Canada. The broad brushstrokes of the US-Mexico agreement, including on autos, agriculture, and intellectual property, are largely positive for us. The 16-year process for review of the agreement is a huge improvement on the Americans' original 5-year sunset proposal. Far from a worst-case scenario, this is broadly good for Canada, for our economy, for investment, and for jobs. The auto deal, for example, helps Canada's struggling industry. We too have lost jobs and investment to low-wage Mexico, and while that's the way free trade is supposed to work, this is no time to be a purist. The issue is whether the deal before us is in Canada's interests. On auto, that answer is an emphatic yes. On supply management of dairy and poultry, the naysayers are presenting any concessions Canada might have to make as somehow a crushing and unacceptable defeat. We think the opposite. There's a far stronger case that liberalizing supply management would be good for Canada. The complicated system of quotas and high tariffs benefits about 16,000 farms at the expense of millions of consumers who are forced to pay higher prices. Put bluntly, low and middle income consumers of milk, cheese, and poultry are forced by government policy to subsidize farmers whose average wealth is $5 million. The rest of the agriculture sector in Canada enjoys no such protections and succeeds very well in the bracing winds of international markets. Reforming supply management or phasing it out altogether is a win for the middle class and for poverty reduction. Enacting reforms as part of a broader trade agreement and providing generous transition arrangements may make such a policy more politically palatable. The bonus is that politicians will be able to blame Donald Trump for forcing this decision on them. The Harper government made concessions on supply management in the original Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement and the CETA agreement with the European Union, with little serious political consequence. Reform is, therefore, both desirable and possible, and Ottawa should embrace it, particularly if it is key to renewing NAFTA. The same advice goes for the Conservative Party, which is inexplicably enthralled to the supply management lobby. This is a moment when our leaders must show they can recognize and defend the national interest, even if there is a political price to be paid. Getting out of supply management, or at least giving US producers much more liberal access to Canadian consumers, will be costly because we have to pay off those who benefit from the current system. Those costs are, however, inconsequential compared to those of failing to reach an agreement covering the full range of Canada-US trade. The supply management tail must not wag the economy-wide dog. Ditto for the intellectual property provisions, which Mexico has accepted, but Canada is still resisting, often, in the case of pharmaceutical patents, to placate the provinces and territories. Strengthened IP protection is good. It's good for innovation, it's good for investment, and it's good for drug access, including specifically the IP changes envisioned in the US-Mexico agreement. They were already acceptable to Canada when they were essentially in the original Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. They make even more sense if they help get NAFTA 2.0 over the finish line. We find ourselves in the curious position where an ill-informed American president has made issues like supply management and IP protection the holy grail for US trade negotiators, while a blinkered Canadian policy has been to dig in our heels over these same issues, which actually hurts the national interests of Canadians. Ottawa should wake up to this reality. In return for a satisfactory bargain on dispute settlement, Canada should offer the access to US dairy products and extended IP protection that the Americans are seeking. That would be a deal Canada could and should sign with enthusiasm and a clear conscience. I'm Brian Lee Crowley for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute.